Okay, so I lied. This is gonna be the last one, I guess. Yeah, had a window of time, kind of open up this afternoon, and I saw there was a little chunk available in this room, so I figured, well, I'll give it one more shot, and I'll start from the back and work forward. Since I'd started from the front and worked back yesterday, and didn't get quite as far as I would have liked to yesterday. Still made a pretty good dent, getting through it, but I'm just gonna try to start from the back and see how far I can get today. Yeah, just break the record here again, but yeah, I'm kind of limited for time, so we'll see how far I get. I felt good yesterday. I felt really good. Felt good energy with it. Felt a little more pep than a couple ago where I was just dead zombie mode or something. So, hoping to keep that going through this one today, and this one will be the last one of these I do. I'm pretty sure. Just looking at the schedule for tomorrow, doesn't look like there's really going to be any time available to do this. So this is actually truly going to be the last one. So I'll just carry over that sentiment from the last video into this one. Yeah, so I guess I'll probably just try to get started and see, like I said, see how far I can get. Like I said, going to start from the back and work forward this time around. First question here, or last question here, number 29. How are multiple use lands administered by the National Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management managed differently than lands designated as wilderness under the 1964 Wilderness Act? Please explain the major differences, including philosophy and purposes of each mandate/system, uses allowed and not allowed in both systems, etc. The issue of managerial discretion and reference the relevant statutes in your answer. So I guess there was a part in parentheses there I read. It's just essentially, please explain the major differences. Please explain the major differences, the issue of managerial discretion, and reference the relevant statutes in your answer. Yeah, and so I guess, yeah, and the initial question is, how is those multiple use lands administered differently than the wilderness lands? Yeah, I guess a little note is, like, I think, this exam more so than the others, I'll definitely, be feeling, I think, the time crunch, hour 20 minutes, and it's roughly, they've been like 12 to 15 questions, I think, the past two. So, and there'll be a mix of these, 5-pointers, 15-pointers, 10-pointers. But yeah, I think this one's going to be the hardest one to manage that time, because there's a few of these questions that I feel like I could really just spew and write some stuff and maybe just get out of control and waste time on. Whereas others, I feel like I might not quite have enough. So we'll see. This one could definitely be a tough one to manage for time, I think. But anyway, getting back to the question, that was just a little side note. So with these I'll just start with the multiple use lands. The multiple use lands, going back to the last exam, that's Multiple Use Sustainable Yield Act for the Forest Service. That's where you find that multiple use mandate for the Forest Service. And then you have FLTMA for the BLM. FLTMA was, 1976. MUSIA was 1960. So, FLTMA came out a bit after, or, quite a bit after that Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act was out for the Forest Service. And essentially, they're very similar, both the multiple use mandates. The FLTMA multiple use mandate they're both worded very similar. So, I kind of just referenced FLTMA here in the answer, but just note that they are very similar in the way they're written and the discretion and that they afford. But anyway, so yeah, it's it just addresses that the agency shall use and observe the principles of multiple use in their their land planning planning decisions. And essentially, it goes on to describe multiple use, and this is a dead horse that we've beaten. But it's the management of the public lands and utilized in the combination of balanced and diverse resources, including but not limited to recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife and fish, and natural, scenic, scientific, and historic values. So in that definition of multiple use, very broad. It throws all these different uses for land. And it doesn't place any weight on any of them in particular. It does no weight on any of them in particular. And it just has things that say utilized in the combination, of balanced and diverse resource uses. I paraphrased it there, and I don't really like how I paraphrased it. I don't think I have a better utilized in a combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. So what's that combination that'll best meet the present and future needs of the American people? That's up to the agency's discretion. There's no particular leaning towards any certain multiple use that it lists in here, and then also leaves it open to, not limited to, including but not limited to. So there could be more multiple uses besides what they have listed here in the statute. Yeah, like I said, balanced and diverse, combination of balanced and diverse resource uses that takes into account, long-term needs of future generations for renewable and non-renewable resources. So, it's very, like I said, very discretionary, like we covered, hammered in that last section or last test. It's multiple use mandates, super discretionary. And we can just look to the case law history too. Additional side note that will kind of play into effect when we move over to the Wilderness Act, but there's no prohibitions either within the multiple use mandates. For those, there's no prohibited uses in a multiple use mandate, not found in MUSIA or FLTMA. Like I said, that'll be play a little more when we get over to Wilderness. But yeah, and then just looking at the case law, when I'm saying how discretionary this is, but especially with MUSIA, he had the Perkins versus Berglund case, the textbook case, where the courts addressed multiple use and the management discretion that's afforded to agencies in the multiple use mandate. And essentially, it's what the court said was, it's multiple, when referring to the multiple use mandate, it's just general clauses and phrases that can hardly be considered concrete limits on agency discretion. And the famous line that it breathes discretion at every pore. So that's some pretty vivid imagery there. But yeah, it's extraordinarily discretionary to the like I said, no weight placed on any particular, no leaning towards any particular multiple use. Is almost entirely up to the agency's discretion as to how they want to manage these, for what multiple use they want to manage these lands for. And I guess there is, one big example that we talked about in the last section of where that, maybe that deference and discretion wasn't afforded to the agency was in the comb wash allotment case, where the BLM had authorized grazing in an allotment, the comb wash allotment. They had used a programmatic EIS and the San Juan area RMP to make that decision, and they were taken to court, litigated that they hadn't, challenged that they hadn't, made the site-specific considerations when deciding on allowing grazing and, when deciding on that multiple, for what multiple use to manage that land for. And therefore, they didn't make that reasoned and informed decision that they show, where they showed that they had balanced the competing resources for that comb wash allotment, and therefore they were remanded in that decision and had to conduct site-specific analysis in order to, reasonably and informedly make that management decision. And they, like I said, they didn't, so the main caveat, or the main thing, I guess, with multiple use that was established in that comb wash allotment case is that these agencies, the BLM and Forest Service, have to at least show some level of a balancing of those competing multiple uses for a section of land before they make a decision, as to how they're going to, manage that, or what they're going to manage that land for. So that, that's about the one big thing, and that pertains to the multiple use mandate, and limiting that discretion is just simply providing reason to, or conducting reasoned and informed analysis and balancing those competing, showing that you balance the competing resources before you make that decision as to how you're going to manage that land. So we're going to slide over to the Wilderness Act now, and okay, so Wilderness Act, it states that these wilderness areas shall be administered for the use and the enjoyment of the American people, leave them unimpaired for future use, and the preservation of their wilderness character. Yet again, paraphrase there. I don't like how I paraphrase these in this slide, but I'm kind of just rolling with it at this point. We're, a little late to change this, change the ship. But anyways, like I said, here I got more of a complete version. Administered for the use and the enjoyment of the American people. Leave them in such manner that will leave them unimpaired for future use, and so as to provide protection of these areas and the preservation of the wilderness character. So there's that preservation of the wilderness character. You got shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people, and then leave them unimpaired and preservation of wilderness character. So in that statute, you already have a it's already guiding those agencies in a certain direction. It's these lands are going to be administered for use and enjoyment of the American people. They're going to be unimpaired for their future use, and they're going to be preserved. That wilderness character is going to be preserved. So that's already compared to the multiple use mandate, you already got some some guides on which direction you're going to go when you're working with these wilderness areas. And then it goes on to further, if you go into the statute and you find that it provides a definition of wilderness. And wilderness, and it's built up of these components in the definition. It's untrammeled by man, undeveloped federal lands. It provides an opportunity for solitude, and then is also to be protected and managed in order, for natural conditions. And then there's some additional stuff like at least 5,000 acres of roadless area, or at least just large enough to be compatible, I believe. And I think those are kind of like, those are the main components of the wilderness described in the statute. And then additionally, the Wilderness Act, outside of this mandate, this non-impairment mandate, there's also Section 4C, you have this list of prohibitions, prohibited actions on the in the wilderness, the designated capital W of wilderness. No commercial enterprise, no permanent roads, no temporary roads, no motor vehicle use, no motorized equipments, no motorboats, no landing of aircraft. I think there's I'm missing a couple on here. No mechanized equipment, so no bicycles, no installations or structures, construction. I think, do I got that in here? Yeah, no other forms of mechanical transport, so yeah, bikes. And then no structure or installation. So, already, and then, so again, just looking back to the Multiple Use Act, we have, these direct prohibitions that, you don't have anything like that in multiple use. But here, where you have those guide rails of non-impairment and, preservation of that wilderness character, yeah, you then get this additional list of actions that are actually prohibited on these wilderness areas. And there is, of course, the minimum necessity exception that comes with those, but that's still, you've got those actual prohibitions in statute. And even down here, I just got, that untrammeled by man, in the definition of wilderness. So that's a, hands-off management, going forward, that not hindering or, restraining those natural processes that, occur, as those natural conditions of the wilderness. And, we saw that come into play in the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge wilderness case, where they installed a set of water tanks within their wilderness, National Wildlife Refuge / wilderness, and Kofa was designated as a National Wildlife Refuge in 1939 by FDR with a key objective of the refuge was to preserve the desert bighorn sheep. And that was, throughout the lifespan of, the National Wildlife Refuge, Kofa, that was one of the main things that they were doing down there, was preserving these bighorn sheep. Well, then in 1990, I believe, it was all, 80, I think it was 82% of that refuge is designated as wilderness. So now it's got that wilderness, it's got the National Wildlife Refuge, and then it gets the wilderness designation put on top of that. So then, they, anyways, kind of moving forward. So now, they have that history of, a goal of that refuge being is that preservation of bighorn sheep, but now they have to, do that within the, the constraints that a wilderness puts on it, because with the National Wildlife Refuge, I can't remember the statute now, statute name for it, but so a key part of the refuge system is that conservation of those species that refuge was designated for. And so that would, they had been previously always done actions on that refuge to preserve those bighorn sheep, but now after that wilderness designation, now they have to actually take into consideration these new stipulations that come with wilderness. And especially I don't, for some reason I don't have it on here, but remember that no installations and no structures prohibition. Well, Kofa National Wildlife Refuge and Wilderness, they start going through some years of drought. The bighorn sheep population goes from its 600 to 800, sheep average. It drops down to 300, around 350. I can't remember the exact number, but it drops off. And they, so then, Kofa National Wildlife Refuge, they conduct some analysis. And they identify some potential reasons as to why these bighorn sheep are, falling off, why their populations are dropping off. and they identify water as a leading potential reason as to why. So they construct these water tanks and install 2 water tanks, and one was actually within the refuge, one was very close to it, but then it also had, I think, from like, part of it was in the refuge essentially. And they're challenged over this as was this a trammeling by installing these water tanks, and the courts did they were remanded in the case. The courts did not side with Kofa National Wildlife Refuge because they I'll get into this in a little bit. I'm kind of straying way off here now, but yeah, so they were remanded in their decision to install these water tanks because they didn't provide evidence that these water tanks were they didn't provide evidence that water was the necessary thing that the bighorn sheep were lacking, and then they also didn't provide any evidence, assuming that the water was the necessary. They didn't provide any evidence that 2 water tanks was the minimum amount of water necessary to boost these bighorn sheep population back. And the courts did side with Kofa in that in their interpretation of, I don't have it on this slide, but in the Wilderness Act does provide, shoot, I don't know if I got it on here, but when it's when it calls out to the administering agency, it's it says they shall conservation is in that. Oh man, I wish I had it on the slide because I can't remember the exact language, but they did conservation to conserve is within the mandate of the Wilderness Act for these administering agencies. So they interpreted that conserve to extend to preserving conserving these bighorn sheep as a part of that natural condition of the park or of the wilderness. And so they the court did side so it wasn't against. It was, it's not that the Kofa couldn't do anything to conserve this, take steps to conserve those bighorn sheep. It's just that they didn't prove that this was the minimum necessary action to do so, the installation of those water tanks. And like I said, I just went way off topic of the question here. But I guess it gets at still the heart of this question towards which, the discretion to agencies for making management decisions in these separate land designations. Because, in the wilderness, you have that Kofa National Wildlife, you have the Fish and Wildlife Service, they're installing water tanks to boost numbers of bighorn sheep, and yet they're still getting litigated. They're getting kind of raked over the coals for doing something that, most people would agree is, sounds like a pretty good thing. Like that's hard to argue with, but it goes against that untrammeling by man, that wilderness character, the untrammeling and wilderness character mandate of the Wilderness Act. Whereas, on the multiple use lands, heck, dude, you can, they're free to pretty much manage those lands in any way they please. If they installed water tanks on there, that would be, I don't know, I don't think it would really raise any concerns. At least, I don't think it would definitely not lead to major litigation. So, just, I guess, examples there, but like I said, went way off topic off that. Might as well just keep going because I just spent like 20 minutes on that one. Okay. What is a national park enabling law? I should have. Here we go. So these are these national park enabling laws are written pursuant to the Organic Act, written by Congress. Pursuant to the Organic Act of the National Park Service, and these are whenever a new park that's been designated post the 1916 Organic Act, each of these new parks comes with its own enabling law. And so you have the 1916 Organic Act, which establishes what the purpose of the parks are. That conserve the scenery. And provide for the enjoyment of the people, for the American people, and then also leave them unimpaired. So you got those main things in the original Organic Act, and that Organic Act also did establish several parks in its when it was passed by Congress. But then it also provided that additional way that new parks would be designated. national parks hereafter created by Congress. So, like I said, going on to the enabling laws. So following the 1916 Act, any new national park that's been designated has been designated with an enabling law. That's it's written pursuant to the Organic Act, so it still holds those holds true to those purposes of parks. But these Organic Acts, enabling acts, sorry, will come with these site-specific designations and rules, and provide certain management criteria that, like I said, that'll pertain to that specific site. And so the primary example that we've hit pretty hard is that the Grand Teton National Park. And in that enabling law, it allows for elk hunting within certain certain sections of the park. Which is typically hunting is usually for most national parks, as far as I know, hunting is a prohibited action. I don't think it's explicitly prohibited in the Organic Act, but it's generally found most national parks it's prohibited. It might actually be prohibited in the Organic Act. I'll have to double check. But yeah, anyway, so Grand Teton National Park, in its enabling law, there's a provision in there that allows for elk hunting within the park, in certain areas of the park. And yeah, I guess so. Like in the chain of command, when making when those national park officials are making management decisions for those said parks, they're first going to look to the enabling law before they look to the Organic Act when making those decisions, because of that those site specific considerations that will be found here in these enabling laws. And and we it's often the Organic Act is referred to as an umbrella statute, and then underneath that umbrella you have these enabling laws as well. I don't know if I don't that metaphor doesn't quite. I understand it. I get the imagery and stuff, but it doesn't resonate. I guess it helps. I don't know to think of it like that, but yeah. So moving on. I guess that's only a 5-point question, so I shouldn't spend any more time than I just did on it. What is the purpose of national park management under the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916? So I have a slide for this one. So the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916, it's often referred to as this dual mandate act, and like I touched on a little bit in the last one, talking about the enabling laws, but it has this first thing that's like shall conserve the scenery. Yeah, manage. Okay, yeah. What is the purpose? So yeah, it's got this first purpose, to conserve the scenery and the natural historic objects and the wildlife therein. And then following that, a couple lines later, it's got this: provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So it calls for, this Organic Act calls, for in the management of these national parks, this first it calls for this conservation of scenery and the natural historic objects, and then it follows that up with providing for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and means that will leave them, and then it calls for an unimpairment of these areas as well. So it's it's referred to as a little bit of a conflicting. These are referred to as conflicting mandates because, and like I have in the example here, around the bison, the bison and snowmobiling in Yellowstone. So history, like just go back on this a little bit. I guess I've just read this into this case a little bit. I haven't done a deep dive, so I'll definitely be missing some details and poorly explain this. But essentially, what it seems like, by grooming the roads in Yellowstone to allow for snowmobiles to access them in the winter, Yellowstone in the winter. These bison will utilize these groomed trails, and I guess they'll follow these roads out of Yellowstone, and it's led to much mortality among those bison. So it led to this litigation and this halting of snowmobiling in the late 90s. But then people snowmobiling recreational groups came back and litigated the National Park Service, stating that it wasn't falling within. So by closing these, the national park, the Yellowstone to that, closing off the grooming of the roads, closing it off to, banning the snowmobiles, they're falling in line with this first mandate, the conserving of scenery and the natural historic objects and wildlife therein. That's they're sticking to that first mandate. well, then people come back, and then those recreation groups, those snowmobile groups come back, and they litigate, and that the Park Service is not following the second mandate here, that providing for the enjoyment in the same such manner. And eventually it goes through multiple iterations of EIS planning, litigation, and it eventually comes out they do allow for that over snow vehicle use, and it's based on, I'm not really sure, but it says it's based on transportation events and not just a certain number allowed per day. I'm not really sure exactly. I didn't look into what a transportation event is exactly. I don't know if that's just like season, essentially, or not sure. Maybe, yeah, I'd have to look into that. But essentially, so they do allow snowmobiling, in the park. And actually, a couple of years ago, my family did go snowmobiling in Yellowstone, and it was pretty cool. I mean, yeah, and obviously now in hindsight, it's like, I probably wouldn't, like, especially after reading about how, the Bison will use those groomed roads and stuff and utilize that and get out of the park, and it results in mortality. And it seems to be a negative in terms of conserving those bison populations and the natural scenery and historic objects. But it did provide some enjoyment. Like, it was a fun day, but so that's the conflict there. That's the controversy with that that dual mandate. And I think that was even a bit beyond that scope of that question. But it was kind of, like I said, to tie it, because I did, like I said, I have done that, and it was cool. It was fun. I definitely got enjoyment out of it. But I can also see, okay, it definitely probably goes against that first mandate. But it's tricky. Like I said, I didn't look into it that hard, so I didn't see, like, what are the numbers, how many, like, what percentage of bison are they losing per winter because of these groomed roads versus when those roads weren't groomed. Is it a pretty good 30% mortality, or whatever. So it's I'd have to look into it more to really have a side on this one. But I'm definitely leaning towards, I would say it's probably not, it's definitely not in line with that conservation of scenery and wildlife therein. But it does provide enjoyment. And like I said, so I don't know, I'm definitely leaning towards probably not allowing snowmobiling in there, but this isn't Tristan's opinion video. This is trying to get, study for the test video. Moving on. Explain the nature of two political compromises evident in the Wilderness Act of... let me just get to the slide. Okay. Explain the nature of two political compromises evident in the Wilderness Act of 1964. Provide an example of how one of these compromises could challenge the management of wilderness character. So, first one I went with is just Section 4D1, which essentially states that such measures may be taken as may be necessary to control fire, insects, disease, subject to such conditions as the Secretary deems desirable. So, these, like I said, these are compromises that are actually found in the Wilderness Act itself. So it's the allowance of it's the allowance of these uses that might or the allowance to do things that might be adverse or go against the actual, like, non-impairment mandate of the Wilderness Act. And like I said, these are compromises, political compromises that were needed to get this thing passed through Congress. Moving on to my second one that I went with was Section 4D3, which is essentially, until midnight, December 31st, 1983, the United States mining laws and all laws pertaining to mineral leasing shall, to the same extent as applicable prior to September 3rd, 1964, extend to those national forest lands designated by this chapter as wilderness areas. So essentially what this, this compromise does there is it provides a 20-year window after the act is passed, for which people can go into these, these wilderness areas, these forested lands, and conduct mining operations, or, go look for, go stake claims, go apply for mineral leases within those areas, do any of those, what's covered in the mining laws, the general mining law, the Mineral Leasing Act. They, those laws are good still for 20 years on these wilderness, newly designated wilderness. So these guys can go in there and do that. And this, they are also, they can claim, they stake a claim, they can apply for patent of these claims up until that 1983 or 1984, I guess. That 1984, that 20-year window closes. They can apply for patents, And so this has resulted in, in-holding, mining claims and in-holdings within these wilderness areas. Like I said, otherwise activities that would be prohibited within a wilderness area. Both these compromises allow for activities that would otherwise be prohibited. And so, just to touch on provide an example of how one of these compromises might challenge the management of the wilderness character. So, we got, the case, in the book, there was the case of the Sierra Club versus Ling, in which the Forest Service had authorized southern pine beetle control measures within a wilderness area. I think it was, I can't remember which states it fell in. It was, I think, Mississippi, down in the southeast. I can't remember for sure. But essentially, yeah, so they had authorized some southern pine beetle control measures, and these control measures required extensive cutting and the use of chemical spraying within that wilderness area. So, definitely going against that management of that wilderness character, that untrammeled by man, those preserving for natural protecting and managing for natural conditions, that undeveloped federal land, that opportunities for solitude. So, there it's definitely easy to see, especially with that extensive cutting and use of chemical spraying. That is certainly, in converse to, I don't think that was the right use of that word, but in it definitely goes against that. Not untrammeling. That definitely would seem to me like a trammeling, especially a trammeling by man, because they're hindering that natural, because that beetle outbreak is a natural process, and I think that the reasoning behind that, taking these measures was that it was going to spread from the wilderness area and affect these adjacent properties and lands, state lands, private lands, and that was why they really implemented these measures. But that definitely could be considered a trammeling, especially if it wasn't, the minimum necessary, but that's the compromise. Those are the compromises there. Ooh. Moving on. 25. Who designates federal wilderness areas? What agencies manage them? Short little question here. I don't even have a slide for this one. I actually, with this exam, I think I almost have a slide for every question. Or I have quite a few questions where multiple, the same slide will work for multiple questions, so that helps. But I think I have 20-something slides for this one. I've kind of just really been going down on that. I think it helped. I like doing it. But anyway. Who designates the federal wilderness areas and what agencies manage them? So going back, I guess I could go to this slide here. So you have it's very similar structure to the when we were talking about the National Park Service and Organic Act, and how they have those enabling laws written pursuant to the Organic Act, both by Congress. It's essentially the same thing for the wilderness areas. So you have the Wilderness Act of 1964, passed by Congress, and in that act it designated certain areas as wilderness at that time, and then they set up the same system that going forward these wildernesses are going to be designated by enabling laws by Congress. So these wilderness areas are designated by Congress, to get at that first part of the question. And these enabling laws will often also contain these, like you mentioned, you talking about the last question, the compromises. Well, these enabling laws might also have certain site-specific compromises and and provisions, similar to maybe how the national parks would have certain site-specific regulation or management criteria different than what's found in the Organic Act. And then what agencies manage them? So the management of these wilderness areas falls to the agency who administered that land immediately prior to that land being designated as wilderness. So if that land was, so say it's a section of land on, it's a section of national forest land, it's then designated as wilderness. It is then managed by the Forest Service immediately following that wilderness designation. So they're managed by, it's either going to be the BLM or Forest Service in most cases. It could be the National Park Service, or like we saw with the the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge. It could also be the Fish and Wildlife Service. It just depends on who is managing that land immediately prior to it being administered as or designated as a wilderness. What is an individual park or national park or wilderness enabling / establishment law? How might these laws impact management of parks and or wilderness areas? So yeah, I guess I'll just stay on this slide because this slide, this is one of those slides that pertains to like 3 or 4 questions, and I've covered this one now already pretty well in the in 2 questions, but I'll hit it again. So like I've said, with the the National Park Service Organic Act and the Wilderness Act of 1964, it's in these acts they established certain national parks and wilderness areas at the time, and then it also set up the system that of how these new parks and wilderness areas would be designated going forward. And essentially, so it sets up the system that Congress will be designating these new national parks or wilderness areas, and they will be doing it by statutorily. Through these enabling laws. So you've got your Organic Act, your Wilderness Act. Well, then you got your enabling laws that are written pursuant to the following the purposes of those Wilderness Acts and Organic Acts, following the purposes established by those acts, but they also maybe contain those site-specific management criteria and or compromises in the case of the wilderness areas. So let me see where I'm at here on this one. Okay, how might these laws impact management of parks and or wilderness areas? So like I've kind of touched on already, especially with the how both of these in these enabling laws and establishment laws, they're tailored site specific to these parks and wilderness areas. So like I said, in the case of Grand Teton National Park earlier, there's provisions in that enabling law that allow for elk hunting within certain areas of the park. Even though that's a very typically a prohibited activity in national parks. And then in the case of I guess here I got the rattlesnake wilderness. In that enabling law, there's a special concession that allows for motorized access by certain officials in order to maintain aquifers within the wilderness. So there's they're going against that that prohibited action of motorized vehicle use. They have a compromise in there specifically to maintain those aquifers, for those employees to maintain those aquifers. Yeah, and like I said, these site enabling laws, enabling acts are very they're site specific, and they're going to go, like I said, in the case of the Wilderness Act, they might go beyond what is found in those Section 4D compromises, or in the in national parks, it might just go against that general purpose of the act to conserve scenery and natural and historic objects and wildlife therein. Yeah, because I guess with that, with the elk hunting. In Grand Teton, you have that purpose in the Organic Act to conserve scenery, natural and historic objects, and the wildlife therein. So, there's that call in the Organic Act for the National Park Service to conserve wildlife. And it could be argued, in the Grand Teton, that hunting is, maybe going a bit against the conservation. And ultimately, it's allowed in Grand Teton because it is, it is, I think those elk numbers need to be managed in order to conserve their future population. So it's conserving, but it's it's definitely against what traditionally in national parks is done, in regards to hunting at least. I don't know if I made that clear how I just explained that last part, but these organic act or enabling laws can differ and even potentially go kind of against what's found in an organic act. By law, federally designated wildernesses are areas to be untrammeled. What does this mean? Provide a management example in your answer. Let's see if I think I have a slide for this. Oh yeah, there it is. But anyways, so untrammeled, it's it's that, just to kind of go into the dictionary definition, to trammel something is to hinder, restrain, shackle, develop, So something that's untrammeled is non-hindered, not restrained, not developed, It's that hands-off management. It's letting those natural processes, those natural conditions, just kind of to go on those wilderness areas. And it's very hands-off management. It's letting those natural processes take place. It's letting those fires burn. It's letting those insects diseases break out. That at least that's in theory what trammeled should mean. Letting those processes take place. Let me see. What does this mean? Okay, so I think it kind of covers what it means. So going into all right, I guess there's also that that two-step inquiry, which I'll get into here in a second with the Kofa case. But one inaction does need to be there's this two-step inquiry that can be used. So one inaction does need to be taken on these in these wilderness areas. It'll hopefully if it fits within this inquiry, it will not result in it'll result in minimal trammeling or no trammeling of those natural processes. So moving into the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge and Wilderness case, like I touched on earlier, Kofa National Wildlife Refuge Wilderness, they installed 2 water tanks within the wilderness to preserve to conserve this population of desert bighorn, which was experiencing some population decline. The numbers were falling off, so they installed these 2 water tanks. Essentially, the courts ended they side against them, the Fish and Wildlife Service in this case, because they didn't provide that the water was the necessary action to conserve these bighorn sheep. They didn't provide evidence that yes, water is the direct reason that these bighorn sheep populations are failing. Additionally, they also didn't provide that 2 tanks were the minimum amount necessary. So say they did, they published some analysis. Yes, it's directly because we've noticed these past 3 years that there's no precipitation or very little, and these streams or ponds that these bighorn sheep have been relying on are drying out, and they are just dying from dehydration and thirst. So they say that's hypothetical. They hypothetically publish that. Well, then they will need to, so that meets step 1. The action would be necessary in that case, then to install these water tanks. What is the minimum amount of said necessary? So how many water tanks would be the minimum amount to conserve these desert bighorn sheep? So then they would need to publish some sort of analysis stating that, well, based off where these historical streams used to flow, or where the distribution of these ponds, we have concluded that 3 water tanks would be the minimum necessary. And they may provide some facts and statistics and stuff. But so that and then in that scenario, they would meet then both the objections, and that would be at least that would be considered not resulting in a trammeling. But in this case, they didn't provide that. Even though the courts did defer to their interpretation of conservation as found in the Wilderness Act, they didn't defer to their assumption that water was necessary, and therefore so that it was deemed that it was a trammeling. And I don't know, in conclusion of the case, I don't know if they had to remove the water tanks that they had installed, or I'm not really sure what exactly happened there, or if they just had to go back and provide that evidence post trial that they were indeed that necessary, and those 2 were the minimum. I guess so that's that's my spew there on trammeling. I always complained about how dry it was in here. My mouth dried out, and I just realized this is a room with a lot of technological equipment. There's another recording studio just behind the monitor in front of me here, but there is just this massive dehumidifier in here. And I guess it makes sense. They don't want moisture building up, and I don't know much about computers, but I don't think moisture goes well with computers. So I don't think they want it's a measure to prevent moisture from building up in these computers and stuff like that. So they got this massive dehumidifier that must just be running on full blast all the time, or at least at night and stuff. So it is super dry in here. So anyone that's heard me complaining about that and being like, yeah, dude, you're in a studio. They have to dehumidify that place. Sorry. Anyway, moving on. How are lands designated as federal wilderness to be managed according to the Wilderness Act of 1960? Did I do this one already? I feel like I answered this one, but maybe I didn't? I don't think I did. Anyways, how are lands designated as federal wilderness to be managed according to the Wilderness Act of 1964? Be sure to explain the term wilderness character and its component parts in your response. So, each agency administering... Do I got a slide? I don't know if I have a slide for this one. Ended slideshow. Umbrella statutes, MPS, again. Nope. Okay. Well, I can just go with this one. It kind of works for it anyway. So, yeah, be sure to explain wilderness character and its component parts in your response. So, Wilderness Act, it calls each agency administering any agency or any area designated as wilderness shall be responsible for preserving the wilderness character of the area. And then, so it's that call to, responsible for preserving, shall be responsible for preserving the wilderness character of the area. And additionally, I guess we had, going the wrong way. Hold up. So, here we got that, wilderness areas shall be administered for the use and the enjoyment of the American people, and then leave them unimpaired for future use in the preservation of their wilderness character. So like I mentioned earlier, there's already in that, in that mandate, that non-impairment mandate, you have some pretty, tight guide rails as to how they're going to have to, manage these lands in these wilderness areas, and that overarching preservation of their wilderness character. So, going back now to whatever slide I was just on, spending more time goofing around with the slides. I talked about it a little bit earlier, that definition of wilderness in statute, and it's 4 main component parts, but there's a little extra 2 thrown in there, but, these are the 4 main ones, at least, that we've kind of just hit on in class. Is that untrammeled by man, undeveloped federal land, managed and protected to preserve its natural conditions, and that opportunity for solitude. Those are like the 4 main component parts. Then there is that additional, at least 5,000 acres or large enough to be administered, to administer necessarily. And so, yeah, so there's that, those 4 component parts. It's that call for that, that untrammeled, hands-off management, undeveloped federal land, preservation of its natural conditions, and providing that opportunity for solitude. And then, also going into that, further going into those prohibited uses within these wilderness areas. So, you have, what do I got on here? Yeah, and then, devoted to, I guess here's that, that part I was kind of getting on with the COFA case. But, these wilderness areas are to be devoted to the public purposes of recreational, scenic, scientific, educational, and conservation and historical use. So, there's that conservation in that clause there, and that is where, COFA had interpreted conservation to extend to conservation of those bighorn sheep in that wilderness. But side tangent, but yeah. Yeah, so the main component parts there in that, that preservation of that wilderness character. And then additionally, you have that prohibited use list that I had mentioned earlier when comparing multiple use and the Wilderness Act. That no commercial enterprise, no permanent roads, no temporary roads, no use of motor vehicle, motorized equipment, or motor boats, no landing of aircraft, no other forms of mechanical transport, bicycles, and no structure or installation. So, it comes with those prohibited uses, as well as with that, non-impairment mandate, and those, those component parts of, of wilderness. They do, like I said, also these prohibitions do come with that, that exception that they may be used only when necessary to meet the minimum requirements to administer the area as wilderness. Like we saw in that COFA case, they just didn't prove that it was the minimum necessary in that case. Let's see, what else I got? Be sure to explain the term wilderness character and its component parts in your response. Do I have anything else here? I feel like I should have more. I don't know. I mean, yeah, and then of course, going into the enabling laws, like we mentioned earlier, how those will have, could have some slightly different compromises, and with those compromises, I should just mention the compromises as well when managing these designated wilderness lands. They do have those compromises to, for, making certain management, just, allowing certain things to, well, one, to get the bill through Congress, but then two, to administer those areas going forward, to preserve that natural, that wilderness character and those natural conditions. Let's see here. Out of water. I might run and use the restroom real quick. I'll be right back. All right. Yeah, I hope you got a little snack break, a little fiber. Yeah. Anyways, so getting back to it here. Let's see, where am I? So that was 22. I'll move on to 21. Holy cats. 21 was the big dog. Yeah. 21 was kind of a big dog. I think I made it a bigger dog than I needed to be. I'm going to stop saying the word dog, though. Okay. All right. Does federal wilderness provide greater protection to lands than those covered by the Wilderness Rule and those designated as areas of critical environmental concern by the BLM? Please be sure to explain and substantiate, and be sure to tell me what you mean by greater. So I'll start off like I have, the previous few times. I'm just going to start off initially with what I mean by how I define greater, at least in this question. So essentially, what I see is what provides greater protection is well, one, kind of just looking at, all right, who designates these, who designates these wilderness areas, who designates these roadless areas, and who designates these ACECs. So these roadless these wilderness areas are, as we've covered pretty heavily, are designated by Congress underneath, pursuant to the Wilderness Act, underneath the Wilderness Act, which was passed by Congress. So this is congressional statute, this is congressional law. And then, with the roadless rule and the ACECs, these are designated by the Forest Service, prior to the, Rare 1 and Rare 2 reviews. These, don't have that congressional wilderness protection. And then these BLM ACECs are designated by the Bureau of Land Management in the RMP process, or, RMP amendment process. So, so these two are designated by agencies. This is designated, wilderness designated by constitutional or statutory law, not constitutional, statutory law by Congress. So therefore, these, the Wilderness Act itself and these wilderness areas are much less, susceptible to change due to that statutory and congressional, designation. Whereas with these two, these are just, regulation and rulemaking that designates these two. these are both very susceptible to change. Whether it be changing that changing political pendulum could definitely changing agency priorities, changing in who's running the ship. These BLM ACECs. Maybe in the next RMP they draft, they decide to pull an area from an ACEC, or maybe they could even amend a plan and remove change what the ACEC designation, or what's allowed and what's not allowed in the ACEC. And that roadless rule is also subject to that change. They could de-designate it via regulation and such. So definitely in that. Okay, so then in that case, by defining that as protection, the Wilderness Act with that congressional and statutory protection is definitely would have the greatest protection over the roadless rule and BLM ACECs, which are regulation and rulemaking. So therefore they can be changed, and therefore they have less protection than the Wilderness Act. Additionally, just looking also at limits on agency discretion, through these acts, and in the Wilderness Act, we mentioned earlier, it's got those tight guide rails as to agency discretion when making decisions for that land. And same with these inventory roadless areas. There's limits to what the in these agency designated areas, but they still place limits. No road construction, and then tight guardrails on what can be done in terms of logging and timber harvests. I think it's mostly limited to like sanitation and salvage logging, but I didn't spend a whole lot of time focusing on the roadless rule, so that could be off. But there's definitely limits on those those 2001 IRAs, inventory roadless areas. And then additionally with the ACECs, these ACECs also have multiple use limits, or limits on those multiple uses within them, in order to preserve and protect against damage to those resources within that those ACECs are designated for, such in the case of the Gunnison sage grouse ACECs in Colorado and Utah, where those have been those ACECs have been were designated in the RMP process, the planning process, and they had restrictions on like mineral entry, roads, recreation, just access and all things in order to protect those Gunnison sage grouse leks from disturbance. So these also provide limits to what that land's going to be used for. However, it's agency made, agency rulemaking and regulation. Let's see what else I got here. I think I'm trying to think what else. I kind of covered what especially like looking also additionally with that Wilderness Act, it has those direct prohibitions like we've covered pretty hard. That no permanent roads, no commercial enterprise, no temporary roads, no motorized vehicle access, no motorized equipment, no motor boats, no landing airplanes, no installations or structures. I think that's no mechanical, no forms of mechanical transport, bicycles, so that Wilderness Act, that also has some strong, with those prohibitions, also places more limits as to what those lands will be, could be used for, or could be done on those lands. But I think the biggest thing is that susceptibility to being changed, being redesignated as something else, is probably the greatest, differentiate. Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess, I mean, they do all come with limits on discretion and but I would say that level of susceptibility to change is definitely a big component to what offers the the greatest versus the least protection. From a designation standpoint, i.e. who designates, how is the U.S. Forest Service's roadless rule different than federal wilderness? So, working backwards here, but, just covered it pretty hard. These wilderness areas are designated by Congress in statute, either through the original Wilderness Act of 1964 or those post-Wilderness Act 1964 enabling laws that establish these or designate these wilderness areas. Versus the the roadless areas are these inventory, they're referred to as IRAs, inventory roadless areas. These areas were, identified in the Rare 1 and Rare 2 reviews that were done, conducted by the Forest Service pursuant to the Wilderness Act, which called upon the Forest Service to do an inventory of their forested lands to identify areas with potential to be wilderness. They identified areas in these, in these Rare 1 and Rare 2 reviews. In these areas, they haven't gotten that, these IRAs haven't gotten that wilderness designation from Congress. But, so the Forest Service does have this 2001 roadless rule that, designates these IRAs. And, that comes with those certain, those stipulations and prohibitions that, we saw, such as road construction and, limits on timber harvests and such. But yeah, from a designation standpoint, those are our IRAs are designated by the Forest Service. The wilderness areas are designated by Congress. So, moving on, I'm kind of at where I was at yesterday. I'm just going to keep going, like I said, and try to get as far as I can till about like the hour 20 mark or so. I don't know, I got quite a bit of time actually yet, so we'll see. Maybe just try to keep going and see how far I can get. What power was given to the President by the Antiquities Act of 1906? On what constitutional basis can Congress provide this power to the President? Why has the designation of national monuments caused conflict or controversy in the past? Make a substantiated argument for or against. I'll probably actually just do what I did the last time, and I'll just combine, because there's 3 questions like this right in a row, and this is the most complex version of the question. It still asks all the same things as the previous 2, but it asks for a bit more, so I'll probably just answer this one and then skip ahead a bit. Not that you needed to know that. Anyways, make a substantiated argument for or against a more expansive use of the Antiquities Act by a president, such as making a landscape scale designation. Please be sure to focus on the law, the text of the statute, and not just provide your political opinion here. So, Antiquities Act of 1906, I'll just read the statute, definition, in his discretion, declared by proclamation, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic and scientific interest that are situated upon lands owned or controlled by the U.S. and may reserve as part thereof parcels of land, limits of which shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. And I like to summarize it a little bit, is that Congress gives the president the authority to, reserve and limit, areas of land that may have these landmarks, these historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, or other objects of historic and scientific interest that are, federal lands. Big key there. These federal lands, preserve or reserve these sections of federal lands. And by doing so, in his proclamation or declaring of these national monuments, he can identify certain multiple uses that might not be allowed on these lands, as well as maybe so he can limit what these land what can be done on these lands. He can limit multiple uses and stuff like that, and limit multiple uses essentially. And how I didn't make sure, and the most common example that comes with these national monuments designations is mineral withdrawal, mineral entry withdrawals from withdrawing that land from mineral entry, which has been a big part of controversy the past couple of years, especially with the the Bears Ears National Monument and how it was designated, then kind of de-designated, or at least a good portion of it was de-designated. And now it's it's definitely going to be, it'll be interesting to see what happens with this the next couple of years. If the Antiquities Act will still be around, and in a given in the future, it's one of those, it's very controversial. And that's going into opinion there. Tristan's opinion came back into the video again. Let me just I'll show him the door real quick. I'll be right back. See you, buddy. Get out of here. All right. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, I gave him the boot. All right. Moving on, or sticking to that question. Congress provided this power to the president via pursuant to the Property Clause of the Constitution. The power given to them by the Property Clause of the Constitution. Congress has the power to make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or property of the United States. so pursuant to the property clause, Congress then provided this, this power here to the president. And in this, in this question here, I decided to go with the making an argument for a more expansive use of the Antiquities Act, whether I actually, personally believe that they should or not. I think, from the, reading the text itself and then looking at some of the case law, it definitely seems like there's very little limit as to how far the president could use the Antiquities Act. But essentially, yeah, so, just looking at the language of the statute, it starts off with, in his discretion, in his discretion, and then, it lists off, declared by proclamation, the whole gambit, and then looking, okay, the limits of which shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. So, shall be confined to the smallest area compatible. So, you read that and it does sound like, okay, there's a little bit of a limit there as to like, okay, it has to be that smallest area compatible. However, as we see in the Tulare County versus Bush case, Clinton in the waning days of his, waning days of his presidency, designates the giant sequoia a national monument, and evidently in Tulare County, or a part of it is in Tulare County. And the plaintiffs argue that the designation of that monument, they litigate, they argue that that the designation of the monument was not confined to the smallest area compatible. So, they take that stance that he, when designating this monument, Bill Clinton did not designate, he didn't confine it to the smallest area compatible. Well, the courts come back and say, they side with Clinton in this case, and they say that the Antiquities Act does not oblige the president to make a meaningful investigation or determination of the smallest area necessary to protect any specified objects or scientific interests. So essentially what they say is that, there's nothing in this act that, that requires that the president counsel, counsel with other, advisors, or, there's no mandate as to how the president determines what this, smallest area compatible is. It's essentially solely up, it's the only, it's to the president's discretion what the smallest area compatible is in here, with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. So, that it's, like, and the court says here, there's nothing in there that will oblige the president to make it, to make an investigation in there. It's the president's discretion. And so, yeah, so, that's one case where, they sided with the president. And then also just kind of looking at, so that's kind of addressing, how big of an area could a president designate? Well, it's up to their discretion what the area, smallest area compatible is. And also the president wanting to be reelected, that is also a pretty big limit on their own discretion to stay popular. But and then, so that's kind of addressing, like the size, potential of monument designation. But then also, okay, so like looking at, earlier in the statute, declared by proclamation, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic and scientific interest. So there, everything else is pretty, like, unambiguous, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, so those are all pretty, like, those are pretty easy to define things, I think, or, unambiguous. But then you get to this last part, and it's other objects of historic and scientific interest. That's where, it's like, oh, that's pretty, that could be considered pretty ambiguous. And therefore, that definitely leaves the door open for the president to make some, some pretty wild designations as well. And we saw that in the President Theodore Roosevelt proclamation of the Grand Canyon, and that was such challenged by Ralph Cameron. And essentially, in that case, it's his designation of the Grand Canyon as a national monument, challenged by this Ralph Cameron miner who had some claims in around the rim of the canyon and within the canyon itself. But the Supreme Court deferred to Theodore Roosevelt's discretion, and pretty much stated what he had stated in his proclamation, that the Grand Canyon is an object of unusual scientific interest. And so I feel like you could consider a lot of things an object of scientific interest. That'd also be pretty hard to argue. And again, it goes back to in his discretion. There's no like mandate to confer with anyone else, like, you know, to determine if something is an object of scientific interest. And you know, also, like, you know, going forward is like it'd be interesting to see like what, with these other things, you know, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures. Well, prehistoric structures not so much, but those historic landmarks and historic structures, it's like, you know, what's going to be considered those things going forward? How old does something have to be considered a historic landmark, or what could be considered a historic landmark or a historic structure? So that's kind of interesting too going forward. But anyway, yeah. So it's like, and the court also in the the Grand Canyon Theodore Roosevelt case, you know, they didn't even get to the size of the monument, but apparently what the decision kind of established was that the size of the monument was not disqualifying for it to be a national monument if the protected object was otherwise of scientific interest. So it met that criteria of being an object of scientific interest, and therefore the size of that monument of the Grand Canyon was not disqualifying for it being being a national monument. And I think, like I said, that's the next 3 questions are pretty much that same thing with just a little less. Our next 2 questions after this one. What is the most significant program in the United States supporting the acquisition of private lands into federal public lands ownership for the purpose of access and conservation? Where does the funding for this program come from? So this is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I still didn't make a slide for this one, but Land and Water Conservation Fund. There's a it's a $900 million a year appropriation provided by the Great American Outdoors Act that was passed in 2020. Still didn't look it up. I think it's 2020. I know it was President Trump that had signed it. I don't know if so I'd assume it was 2020 then. Not sure why I just got hung up on that. Anyway, and a large part of these revenues for this $900 million appropriation come from largely from royalties from offshore oil and gas development, but then there's an additional surplus federal property sales and federal motorboat fuel tax. So, but it's generated from revenues from federal, whether it be that oil and gas development, offshore oil and gas development, or those motorboat fuel tax and surplus federal property sales. And I guess in class we talked about how this is that Land and Water Conservation Fund, LWCF, is plays a big role in acquiring those inholdings that might be found, especially within like national parks. That's usually, that's kind of one of the big areas where it's used or utilized, is acquiring those inholdings into the park. Okay, let's see here. In a nutshell, how is the ESA different than NEPA in terms of its substantive? Let's see if I got a... What cases do I talk about here? No, let's go back to section 7 and 9, I guess. Okay. So getting back into ESA now, which the rest of the exam I think is pretty much focused on that. In a nutshell, how is the ESA different than NEPA in terms of its substantive, not procedural obligations? Please be sure to discuss jeopardy and the no-take provisions of the ESA. Why has the judiciary been significant in the development of both laws? Please explain with example, and be sure to reference TVA v. Hill. So I think the past few times I've just kind of let off with NEPA, and I'll probably just keep doing that at this point in the game. NEPA Section 102 is the action foreseeing mechanism of NEPA, and it applies to all major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. And essentially, what it does is it provides that when an EIS is required, and then what needs to be done in an EIS. And so essentially, what needs to be in that EIS is that foreseeable environmental effects. Those adverse environmental effects that cannot be avoided, reasonable range of alternatives and the potential effects of those alternatives, short-term uses and maintenance of the long-term productivity, irreversible and irretrievable commitments of federal resources. And then additionally, there's that provision that the EIS, or I don't think it actually says EIS in the in the provision, but it it says that EIS shall accompany the proposal through the existing agency review process. So you see that shall in there. That's a little bit of a indicator of some substantive and enforceable language. And then we talking, just going back, cause so a lot of that that EIS process is considered largely procedural. And the NEPA, as we talked about in Test 1, is a largely procedural act, or considered a largely procedural law. But and that's that was further confirmed and reassured in the Robertson versus Meadow Valley case, where the courts they had stated that NEPA itself does not mandate a particular result, but simply prescribes the necessary process, as required by Section 102, which I just read. And it's NEPA merely prohibits uninformed rather than unwise agency action. So there's essentially that by stating that it's, as long as the agency goes through and considers does this, goes through the process, they're free to make the decision that they please, whether it is maybe not environmentally the most friendly decision in the world. It as long as they've gone through the process and are informed on the the effects of their decision, they're free to make the decision that they please. Now, we did see how that last part, that kind of enforceable, that shall accompany the proposal through the existing agency review process, we saw that come into play a bit with the, we saw a little bit of substance and enforceable language in NEPA with that, and that came to play in the Calvert-Cliffs versus the Atomic Energy Commission case, where the Atomic Energy Commission went through the procedural, procedural side of NEPA. However, so they did the EIS, they conducted it, they, conducted everything that they had needed to for that EIS, and then they didn't, take that hard look, they didn't consider it, they didn't, it didn't accompany the proposal through the existing review process, and therefore, they went to court and they were remanded in that decision because they hadn't taken that hard look. And that was kind of, that was kind of the, that shows that there is some substantive requirement from the NEPA to take that hard look and consider the effects of your actions. Now, it doesn't affect, like I said, it doesn't require any sort of action leaning any way, but it still requires that they do take, they go through the process and then they take a hard look and consider everything that they find in that process. So then moving over to ESA Section 7 and 9, these are toothy, these are substantive, enforceable in every sense of the words. Yesterday I used the description of you got Section 7, that's Rocky Balboa, and then Section 9 you got Ivan Drago. Both of them are just, they're coming in and they're throwing punches. You don't want to fight either of them because they are they're toothy, they're environmental, and they will pack a punch. So, Section 7 is only directed towards those federal actors and actions, and it requires that an agency ensure that actions will not jeopardize the continued existence of a species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat. So there's that requirement to, requirement that agencies ensure that they don't jeopardize continued existence and destruction of that adverse modification of habitat. Additionally, Section 7 also has that consultation provision, which requires that these agencies, if they are, engaging in potential actions that could result in these, these jeopardization and or destruction of habitat, to engage, to consult with, whether it's the FWS or NOAA, to consult with them about on how to avoid causing, jeopardy or to habitat destruction. And we see the strength, the teeth, the punch of Section 7 here, in that TVA v. Hill case, where it was the TVA dam was going to result in severe adverse critical habitat modification and jeopardization of the snail darter, even with a large amount of resources utilized and money spent. The dam was halted and enjoined by the courts because it was a violation of the Section 7 jeopardy clause. So then moving into Section 9, essentially it's that unlawful for any person to take any such species. So this one applies to any person, not just those federal actors and federal actions. this applies to those federal, state, private individuals as well. It's that prohibition of taking of any endangered species in the statute. However, that can be, this Section 9 protection can be extended to those threatened species by the FWS or Secretary, through Section 4D of the ESA. And it also, going into into this definition of take in the statute, it extends to, take is this defined as harass, harm, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, or collect or attempt to engage in any such conduct. And we saw how, most of those are, like I said, pretty unambiguous. However, you get, harm is where there's been there's some ambiguity, what constitutes harm. And it's further, and it led, we saw how it could be used in cases like Palila versus the Department of Natural Resources, and that extension to indirect takes of these, that these indirect takes that fall under Section 9 prohibition. And we saw, like I said, in Palila versus the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources, Hawaii introduces these feral goats for recreational sport hunting. Feral goats eat the shoots and seedlings of mamane trees. The endangered Palila bird requires mature mamane trees for shelter and habitat. However, by consuming these shoots and seedlings, it's therefore destroying habitat for those future potential Palila birds, and therefore was determined to be harming the Palila, and was an indirect take that fell under Section 9 prohibition, and the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources was remanded. So both those cases, TVA v. Hill, the Palila case, show the teeth of these provisions of the ESA. Head rush on that one. Trying to decide if I want to do this question or I want to just hang it up here. I wish I ran out of water. Okay, let me think. I'm just trying to read it and get a mental script going before I start. Be sure to discuss administrative discretion and the role of the courts and how they generally view these. I'm going to come back to this one if I'm feeling it, because I got a couple short ones I can hit and then maybe come back to it. Nope, wrong way. Okay, here we go. Someday. There we go. Okay. What is one benefit for a listed species covered by a habitat conservation plan? So for these species that are covered by the habitat conservation plans, well, in order for a landowner's habitat conservation plan to be approved, so they can receive an incidental take permit, they must provide in their conservation plan draft the measures, the mitigating and the mitigating measures that they're going to take, mitigating and minimizing measures that they're going to take in order to ensure that that they're going to reduce what am I getting at here? Let's see. Yeah, okay, yeah, designed to mitigate the impact of okay. Submit this conservation plan. They're going to take measures that are, designed to minimize and mitigate the impact of development activities on protected species that may be on their land. So these landowners, to enter, to have a HCP approved, they have to show that they're going to be taking steps to, for these, the benefit of these listed species. So for these protected species or listed species covered by a HCP, they're definitely going to be, privy to, they're going to be privy to having, better habitat available, more habitat available, as well as that, that reduction or that elimination of those perverse incentives that maybe existed prior to the HCP system and the ITP system, where landowners before that would have just much rather have not had endangered species or listed species at all on their property. They would have just made their property inhospitable to these listed species, or even maybe just pulled the shoot, shovel, shut up maneuver to hide any potentially listed species on their property in order to continue actions. However, with the HCP system, these landowners can now continue actions on their property while also providing habitat and being willing to more willing to have these listed species around with that that risk of liability and litigation not hanging over their head. So it's going to result in better habitat or actual measures taken to conserve these species on private land where a large percentage of these species exist, versus before where there wasn't that. There may be just there was those perverse incentives. So there's definitely benefits for those species is better habitat, or potentially better habitat and measures taken to ensure that that the impacts on those species are minimized and mitigated. And I answered this a little bit with this last one, but what is one benefit to the non-federal actors / permittees involved in a HCP? Well, entering that HCP, you receive your incidental take permit, so it removes that liability above your head. So now you can continue doing work on your property, and you're also not worried about facing penalties if there is an incidental take that occurs on your property of a listed species. So yeah, it's that removal of liability and that ability to continue doing work on your property. And there was it goes a little further. There's that 1994, the 94 no surprises policy, in which there's that these landowners who are committed to these HCPs that are approved, they have their incidental take permits. Well, under that policy, which was instituted to boost recruitment or boost enrollment in the HCP program. But under the no surprises policy, it protects those landowners. So if there's, say, changing management requirements for these listed species, well, if they're already engaged in an HCP, that's then they're not required to change their commitments as far as management and money and additional land or financial compensation. That's already more so than it was established in their HCP. So they're protected from no surprises. A deal is a deal, essentially. And it goes beyond just listed species, but also if they address unlisted species in that HCP and measures and mitigating means to limit impacts on those unlisted species, then say that unlisted species becomes listed, they don't have to draft a new HCP as long as they adequately address those unlisted species in the original HCP. What ESA provision helps protect geographic areas, occupied and unoccupied, that are essential to the conservation of listed species? How does the designation help achieve the fundamental purpose of the ESA? So there's the Section 5. This is getting at the Section 5 critical habitat designation. And essentially, in this Section 5 critical habitat, it required that critical habitat be designated within 1 year of post-listing of a listed species. And in the original 1973 ESA, it was the same as designating a species. It was to be solely based on best available science. However, that was changed post TVA v. Hill in 1978 to also include an economic analysis as well as other site-specific considerations. And this designation of critical habitat. So when those that critical habitat is identified, it extends it extends that Section 7 protection beyond just those species. It extends it to that critical habitat, like we saw in the snail darter case, where that Little Tennessee Valley River was designated as critical habitat, and therefore by building the dam on it, it would have been detrimental to the snail darter, jeopardized the snail darter, and therefore led to the enjoyment of that dam. And and I guess in the Section 5, it also establishes that this critical habitat is to provide food and shelter for those listed species as well. Section 10, number 10, as it applies to the ESA, what is a candidate species? So these candidate species are those warranted but precluded. They're under consideration to being listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. However, they are, they're maybe, they're either not, they're not they're not currently listed, but they may be under consideration. Like I said, or they're those species that, maybe they were, they've been under review, and the agency determines that yes, this species, listing of this species is warranted, but it is precluded at this time due to other agency priorities, and they're effectively kind of placed on hold until that, until the stars align and the priorities shift, and they're able to either list those species, or not. And then additionally, these candidate species may also just they might not receive the listing protection, but other federal agencies or other entities may propose strategies to improve the status of a candidate species in order to prevent it from becoming endangered or threatened. And like I said, these don't have any of those ESA Section 7 or 9 protections like the threatened or endangered species. I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. So so this was actually the last one. I don't think I'll be doing another one of these for this class at least. But so thank you. If anyone ever actually does end up watching these, sorry. I don't know. Like I said, I can't sit through these videos. I can't imagine somebody else doing it. But if you do, hats off to you. Kudos. Description of all these videos has the textbook as well as the professor in the class that I'm taking this learning this material in. So if you're ever interested in actually exploring any of these topics more in depth, please go to the description, find that textbook. I guess if you want to take the class, here at the University of Montana, I would definitely recommend it. It's an awesome class. I've learned a ton. It's been way different than anything else I've taken, but it's probably been one of my favorites. Honestly, it's it's been a fun class. So, but definitely, if you're ever interested in learning anything more about this stuff, please go to the description, find that textbook, or come here to the University of Montana and take this class. So thanks. I guess this is probably it for this series. Bye.